Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Protection Warrior in Dragonflight Season 2. Now I kind of want to start this off by answering three basic questions. How does it play, what is it good at, and why play it at all? In terms of how it plays, Prot Warrior is fairly simple. You have three main offensive skills, Shield Slam, Thunderclap, and Revenge, and you use those basically to generate rage and then potentially to spend rage to deal single target and AoE damage and hold threat, and that, it's a pretty straightforward offensive skill set. Much more streamlined and simple than Brewmaster Monk or even like Blood DK or Prot Pally. Defensively, it's also pretty simple, pretty streamlined. You have shield block that you keep up 100% of the time, and you have ignore pain that you spend the rest of your rage on if you're trying to maximize defenses. And there is a little bit of complexity in balancing the rage that you spend on revenge versus the rage you spend on ignore pain, but it's just not that complicated when you compare it to a lot of other tanks. And that is one of the things that Warrior's good at. I mean, if I had to answer the question, what is Warrior good at? The answer is everything. It's a good all-around spec. It's good in Mythic Plus, it's good in Raid, probably good in PvP as a flag runner. I don't know, but it is very mobile and it has great offensive and defensive cooldowns, and that makes it pretty good at everything. It deals good damage, it has good burst damage cooldowns, good AoE damage, good execute damage in single target, good non-execute damage in single target. And just in general, it's a really good tank. It has good group utility in the form of Battle Shout, Rallying Cry. It has stuns and Intimidating Shout for helping with CCs in dungeons. And, it's just a really, really good tank that's in really good shape right now. It's sort of a meta spec. It spent all of the, let's say, first 75% of the first season of Dragonflight as the ultimate meta spec among tanks, before eventually getting eclipsed by Paladin, which got some incredible buffs, even though it was already a really strong and undervalued spec. And now Paladin has sort of taken its place, but Prot Warrior's still in really good condition. And if anything happens to Paladin, I think Prot Warrior's going to be right there to reclaim the throne, or certainly be in contention for it. Spell Reflection is something I haven't really mentioned yet, and that is another piece of amazing utility that they have that is particularly good in Mythic Plus, being able to reflect lots of different skills on trash packs that can be extremely dangerous, like thinking about Season 1, Court of Stars, the Shadow Mistresses, do a Shadow Slash that when those mobs were fortified and bolstered up, that could hit for like 400,000 damage on another tank, or you can reflect it and do 400,000 damage on a Prot Warrior. Pretty nice. Lots of different things like that abound throughout Mythic Plus. That's really good. And again, I think the biggest draw for me with Prot Warrior is just the simplicity. It's easy to play. There's a limited number of keybinds that you need. There's a fairly high amount of offensive cooldowns, but a relatively limited skill set of defensive cooldowns, but they're up very often due to the way that anger management is designed. And that has this really positive feedback loop where you're encouraged to spend all your cooldowns and play very aggressively all the time so that your cooldowns are then up more often, which rewards you for that aggressiveness. I really like that aspect of Prot Warrior. And if I had to point to any sort of like deficiencies or downsides of Prot Warrior, it really is just the self-healing is pretty non-existent. You have more than you have had in previous expansions, but it's still not great. And you need to be in melee range, generating rage to stay alive. Like, this isn't a tank that you kite on. When you have raid mechanics that force you out of melee range, that can actually be quite dangerous on a Prot Warrior, whereas like on a monk or a pally or something, you step out of melee range and you hit Expel Harm or Word of Glory or Lay on Hands or whatever, and you're fine. On a Prot Warrior, you might need some sort of external cooldown or to be using a health pod or like shield walling for that. Cooldown timing is also just something you kind of have to learn on Prot Warrior. Frankly, I think it's quite a bit easier than learning, say, a monk. But there's a little bit of skill when it comes to managing all of the cooldowns that Prot Warrior has. But that's pretty much it. Warrior's extremely strong. It's really in good shape, and I think the main reason that people have kind of moved on from it to Pally, other than Pally just being a little overpowered, really is just like exhaustion. It was good for 4 or 5 months. People get a little bored of it. That is literally all that's wrong with it. Not anything bad. I think people just like to move on to the next flavor of the month, and Honestly, same. Prot Warrior's tier set bonuses are pretty simple, but really good, and they synergize pretty nicely with some of your more interesting talents. The tier set bonus revolves primarily around using Last Stand aggressively, basically turning it into an offensive cooldown. The 2-piece bonus grants a large increase to Shield Slam's damage, 15%, and tons of cooldown reduction to Last Stand, which synergizes with Bolster to make it a must-have talent. The 4-piece bonus grants a major offensive and minor defensive buff when Last Stand expires. So for 20 seconds after the end of Last Stand, you get a really huge damage nova, or I should say large amount of damage as an AoE when you use Shield Slam, and then you also apply a 5% damage reduction debuff for 5 seconds. Now that 5% is a little underwhelming. I would expect this to be more like 10%. Or to last longer than 5 seconds. Maybe if it lasted 10 seconds, that might be something. But either way, the damage output that you gain from that is pretty high. And, it really just, along with the 2-piece, doubling that damage increase that you get to Shield Slam while Last Stand is up, just sort of works to make Last Stand into a pretty nice offensive cooldown, kind of the same way that Booming Voice does with Demoralizing Shout. All of this encourages you to use Last Stand on cooldown, whether you're tanking or not, and that is in order to maximize your damage output and cooldown uptime. This is basically the same way that you use Demoralizing Shout. Now, if you're really challenged defensively in a raid, maybe you would hold those until you taunt and then immediately open with them upon taunting. But I think, generally speaking, you are just going to be hitting everything defensive cooldown or whatever that functions as an offensive cooldown. So again, Demoralizing Shout with Booming Voice, Last Stand with this tier set, I think you're hitting those on cooldown. It's kind of a strange approach to using defensive cooldowns compared to the way that you would on any other class. Last Stand has historically been a reactive lifeline. Your health drops low, you hit Last Stand. But it works pretty well, and the synergy between this tier set and the rest of your toolkit, the rest of the way that you play Prot Warrior, is undeniable. This tier set also highly rewards you for consistently hitting Shield Slam as soon as it resets, which is a great habit to reinforce through game design, so I really like the design of this tier set on Blizzard's end as well. I threw this tier set under the bus when it was first unveiled on the PTR because it was horrendously tuned, but the design has been good the whole time, and they had to quadruple it from the first unveiling on PTR, but mission success. It's a good tier set now. All right, these are the Protection Warrior talents, and I have 3 setups that I want to go over here. 2 main ones, and then one secondary one. The Mythic Plus setup, which is what I'm going to start with, and then a raid setup, primarily focused on single targets, since the raid is about 7 or 8 single target bosses with maybe a couple of adds here and there, and then 1 actual full-on hectic AoE fight. So starting with the Mythic Plus, just to kind of point out what is a little bit different about this spec compared to the raid one, you pick up a lot of CC in here. You take Intimidating Shout, you take Stormbolt, you take Shockwave, all of these great CC tools that are worth giving up some damage increase options like Uproar and potentially Honed Reflexes. It's not really that great, but it is a pretty decent talent. It has decent synergy with the new tier set. Now, until you get the tier set, you definitely don't need to take this. You don't even really need to take this once you have it. You could very easily just put this point into Pain and Gain, or at least for me in the meantime, I'm just keeping it in Bounding Stride. You definitely don't need Bounding Stride. There's not nearly as much in the way of mobility requirements in Mythic Plus as there is in Raid. I just like Bounding Stride. I feel uncomfortable. I feel like I'm not, I don't know, it just feels wrong to not have that cooldown reduction on leap and also the move speed on leap after the leap. But anyhow, definitely a little bit of wiggle room kind of here in the middle of the tree. Pain and Gain being sort of just a decent little generic fallback defensive talent. Not a requirement, but if you're feeling stressed at all defensively, it can be helpful. There are a lot of talents in here that are definitely mandatory. You want to run Thunderous Roar with Thunderous Words. You want to run Avatar with Unstoppable Force. Those are non-negotiable. Picking up Rallying Cry, Spell Reflection, that sort of thing. Pretty non-negotiable. Sidearm is definitely not required, but it is just kind of free damage, free real estate, so good to have. One notable talent here is Barbaric Training. I'm very much in the camp now of getting out of this talent. There have been a lot of people pushing back against using this anymore, as we're moving away from this Vault of the Incarnate set that was more oriented around rage and it being sort of a good talent, around revenge. Now it's going the way of the dodo. I mean, for one, this talent makes it so that your rage cost on revenge is 50% higher, but the damage is only 25% higher. Like, it's just not a very economical trade. But then also with things trending more in a shield slam direction, honed reflexes gains a little bit of steam. Barbaric training definitely losing some. Over here in the right-hand tree, most of this stuff is pretty much boilerplate. For anything that's AoE, Blood Surge is really good. For like 3 targets or more, it winds up beating out Instigate for damage. And then that rage generation is just very nice for giving you more rage to fuel, everything about your kit. Ignore pain, shield block, revenge, all that good stuff. I like sudden death for single target. We'll get into that in the raid setup. But in AoE and in Mythic Plus situations, Show of Horse is just clearly superior. Taking shield charge and Champion's Bulwark is like an obvious must-have, and Sims indicate that Battering Ram is worth like 5,000 DPS if you're using it correctly. You're using Avatar and Demo Shout with here it is, Booming Voice, getting that damage boost, and then hitting shield charge immediately thereafter. Like, Battering Ram actually winds up being a very significant DPS increase, and worth having basically in every situation. Enduring Defense is critical for maintaining your shield block uptime. Couldn't live without this talent. And Impenetrable Wall, similarly, just a really strong talent that gives you a lot of extra rage and a lot of cooldown reduction on shield wall. Very good. This means that you don't really have a way to pick up spell block without giving up something that you want. Kind of a good situation to be in, honestly, having this many good talents available. I think for Mythic Plus, the talent that I would be willing to give up historically would have been Punish, and at least until I had the new tier set bonuses, it probably would be Punish. I think it might actually be Blood Surge. It really depends on how big you're pulling in Mythic Plus, but probably either Punish or Blood Surge would be what I would drop to pick up spell block. But I think really in Mythic Plus, I would just try to get away with not using spell block. The alternative in Mythic Plus that I wouldn't use once I had the new tier set bonuses, but you could use prior to that point, would be to just run Heavy Repercussions and then still take spell block and not bother with Bolster. You're not getting all that cooldown reduction on Last Stand until you have the tier set, at least the 2-piece. Once I had the 2-piece, I would switch over to Bolster and switch over to Into the Fray, and that would be that. Prior to that point, Heavy Repercussions will guarantee that you have 100% shield block uptime. You won't have to be worrying about hitting Last Stand and kind of managing that in order to hit that 100%. You just have it basically by default. And then you can pick up spell block and be pretty much immune to spells for 20 seconds on a 90-second cooldown, which is pretty nice. Now let's move over to the raid setup. And again, I would say the same rule applies in raid. Until I had the 2-piece, I would maybe think about dropping Bolster to pick up spell block if it's a situation where I feel like I need spell block. Rashok, the Elder, comes to mind as a fight where you're going to get hit with a really hard spell hit. Picking up spell block would be useful in that situation. I think in raid, though, you're taunt swapping a lot of the bosses back and forth, so I don't think you necessarily would need to take Heavy Repercussions. Even in situations where you might drop Bolster, I think you could maybe get away with Into the Fray there. But again, you could do, if you're just trying to stay alive and not worried so much about damage, Heavy Repercussions is actually pretty good in single target. Gives you a lot of rage generation, and that is a possible setup. Over here in the left-hand tree, you'll notice we're locking in on Bounding Stride, we're taking Pain and Gain and Honed Reflexes, and we're not bothering with Seismic Reverberation, because this is only useful, it's incredibly useful in AoE, but it's literally only useful against 3 or more enemies. So for pure single target, it doesn't do anything. We're also not coming over here to get Shockwave. You don't need a stun in raid, you don't need Fear in raid, you don't need Stormbolt in raid, so all of those points get moved elsewhere, and that's pretty nice. I'm taking Inspiring Presence here. I guess if you wanted, you could take Intervene, or you could take like Bitter Immunity maybe, just to have like a health potion self whatever health stone for yourself, sorta. You could just put a point in overwhelming rage. It's kind of an okay option too. Helps you prevent from rage capping, which does happen at times. But I like the group-oriented focus of Inspiring Presence. Just makes your rallying cry a little bit stronger of a raid-wide cooldown. In the right-hand tree, if you're in single target or two target, Blood Surge isn't going to be as good as Instigate. This is especially true if you're getting the Wind Fury in the Wind Fury totem group, which that is my details name, Wind Fury group now. You want to be in that Wind Fury totem group and getting all the value you can out of your Devastator and Instigate and your auto attacks and so on. Not really all that much changes in the right-hand tree. One thing, obviously, that changes is you're changing Show of Force over for Sudden Death. But other than that, you're keeping a lot of these same talents. Battle-Scarred Veteran, unfortunately, is still just a horrendous talent. It has this tendency to proc based on, like, pre-mitigation damage values. So it says when your health is brought below 30%, but that isn't how it works. You'll take a hit, you'll go down to like 65% health, and then it'll proc, and now it's on cooldown for the next 3 minutes. Terrible talent. It's a really good idea. Prot Pally has a very similar talent that works the way that it's written, and it's on a 45-second cooldown, 4 seconds of shield wall for them. If they did something like that for Warrior, gave them about like a 45-second shield wall that procced when you hit like 30% health and actually hit 30% health, I think that would be pretty good. You'd be in pretty good shape. But as it currently stands as talent, terrible. Other than that, I'll just show off the AoE raid talent setup. It changes very, very little. The only real thing that changes here is Seismic Reverberation. You definitely want to pick that up, and it is your choice as to what you drop. I kept Inspiring Presence just because I'm more interested in having that useful rallying cry for the group. But I am thinking about things from like a mythic raid progression level where we have that scheduled and it's being called by somebody. If I was just more worried about like my own survival and in a little bit less organized of a group setting, I'd probably drop that and just take Pain and Gain and have a little bit more guaranteed defensive value out of that. Also, there are some fights where you really don't have to move that much. Rashock the Elder comes to mind as one. You could drop Bounding Stride for that too. Heroic Leap without Bounding Stride, actually good enough, I think, for that fight, and for a lot of fights, really. Similarly, I dropped Sudden Death for Show of Force. That's kind of depends on the fight. A lot of the pure single target fights, obviously, you're going to be taking Sudden Death. Some of the fights where there's a handful of ad spawns, the only one that really comes to mind is like Zakarn. Maybe you'll get enough damage on the ads out of Show of Force for it to be worth it. But I probably would consider running Sudden Death even in most of the ad cleave fights. I think the only one, just to pull up the raid list here, where I would definitely run Show of Force would be Azalta the Zakali, and that's because there's like dozens of ads in that fight, and I would definitely want to have that instead of Sudden Death. But pretty much every other fight in the raid, I think I'm going to be running Sudden Death. I think. And finally, just to kind of finish up on it, like, again, reiterating that the bolster into the fray setup works really, really well once you have the tier set. But prior to that point, if you're feeling like you're having any trouble at all maintaining shield block, you can just swap to heavy repercussions. You're good to go. And if you did, once you have the tier set, all that, you did want to pick up spell block, the talent to drop for that would be Instigate. It's definitely the weakest of all the talents in this middle of the tree. And that would be true in both single target and AoE. So just to show off what that would look like, here in the single target setup, taking spell block, dropping Instigate, there you go. It is a DPS loss, but you're picking up an insane defensive cooldown to get it. I think it's worth it. Alright, that is it. Prot Warrior talents. Alright, now let's talk about your abilities as a Prot Warrior. Shield Slam is your main rotational skill. It's your main rage generator, and you have a ton of great talents that add extra value onto it. You also have a tier set that adds a lot of extra value onto it. Thunderclap is your secondary rage generator and a great damage dealing spell or skill in AoE. Revenge is your main offensive rage spender. Execute is better for single target damage, but it only works when enemies are in execute range or when Sudden Death procs. When you have Avatar active, if you're talented into Unstoppable Force, your Thunderclap will hit super hard and should be your core skill in AoE. Your rotation will basically look like Thunderclap, Shield Slam, Thunderclap, Revenge, Thunderclap, something else, Thunderclap, another skill, Thunderclap, repeat. Let's go over the main defensive skills you have as a prot warrior. You have Shield Block, which you want to maintain 100% of the time you're tanking. Your talent setup should make this pretty easy. If you are taunt swapping a boss back and forth in raid, you can let Shield Block drop while you're not tanking. That's fine, you don't need it up if you're not being auto-attacked. Just be sure that when you are being auto-attacked, it is active. It's actually that simple. After that, you have Ignore Pain to absorb any damage that gets past your shield, and you can use Impending Victory as a quick self-heal when your health drops a bit low. The main bit of skill, I guess, in terms of your rotation to kind of learn and figure out as a prot warrior is balancing your rage expenditure between Ignore Pain and Revenge. And that's something you kind of do have to figure out based on just how much damage you're taking, how healthy you feel. But a pretty good mix of both Ignore Pain and Revenge is ideal. Now let's talk about cooldowns. Using them is pretty simple. You want to use Avatar and Demoralizing Shout as much as you can. The same goes for Ravager and Shield Charge. Demoralizing Shout and Shield Charge are kind of a 2-button combo. You hit Demo Shout, then you hit Shield Charge. You deal a huge burst of damage and give yourself a lot of damage reduction and rage as well. As for Shield Wall, be liberal with it. The cooldown on Shield Wall is really short, thanks to all of your talents synergizing together. The same goes for Spell Reflection. If there is a specific spell that you're trying to reflect, usually in Mythic Plus on trash pulls, then you'll kind of want to hold it and, target in on that particular spell. But if you're not in a situation where there's any sort of valuable spells that you can reflect, you just kind of want to use it whenever you're about to take some spell damage. Hit Spell Reflection, free 20% damage reduction, not bad. Rallying Cry is great when your raid or dungeon group needs it for a specific mechanic. Otherwise, you just kind of want to use it when bosses are going to deal big, unavoidable hits. You can use it for yourself, as needed, or maybe to help your group out with some sort of big, unavoidable hit. If you don't have the tier set yet, the same goes for Last Stand. Obviously not for your group, but for your own survival through big, predictable burst damage. Last Stand can also be useful as a reactive cooldown, though, because it is off the global cooldown. So if your health suddenly drops down to like 20%, hitting Last Stand can buy you a bit of breathing room. Of course, if you are using the tier set, you're more likely to just hit Last Stand on cooldown, and rightly so. It's a very useful offensive and defensive cooldown once you have that tier set. Now let's talk about how to pull on a Protection Warrior. I know pulling packs of mobs and dungeons can be kind of challenging for newer players, and that's really something I want to emphasize here. I like to start by charging in and hitting Thunderclap. Pretty simple. You want to get Shield Block up immediately in the pull. I always try to hit Avatar if it's available while I am in the process of charging into melee range, and then Thunderclap immediately afterward so that Thunderclap is buffed by the Avatar. I would then use Shield Block, Demoralizing Shout to get that damage buff active, Shield Charge immediately to do a huge burst of damage and kind of lock up threat, Thunderclap again, and then roll in the rest of my offensive cooldowns. Things like Thunderous Roar, Ravager, or if there's something you want to stop an enemy from casting, you could use Shockwave, but at that point you'll pretty much have threat locked up. You'll want to use Shield Slam to generate rage, but getting that AoE damage out at the very beginning of a pull is really important for establishing threat, making sure everything's on you and also gathered up so that your party can AoE it down, and then you can proceed into a more normal rotation. If you don't have Avatar active when you're going into the start of the pull, you can still get in there with just Thunderclap and Revenge, and that should get threat locked down. If you have Thunderous Roar available, that'll help a lot too. Demoralizing Shout and Shield Charge, obviously great AoE damage, burst threat skill, and Ravager's actually pretty decent too, and it'll let you kind of spam Revenge a little bit, which is nice. Alright, now in terms of stats, warriors want to enchant and gem for haste, and while historically versatility has been your second best secondary stat, it's actually been replaced by crit in dungeons, and I would argue probably in raids too. It's a little bit better than versatility just as a damage scaling stat. And because you're so good at dealing with magic damage thanks to the combination of all of your defensive cooldowns, but also spell reflection and ignore pain, versatility's value is actually not as high as it is for other tanks, whereas crit, it gives you just straight up parry chance, and that is generally more effective for damage reduction over the course of a pull. It's obviously not quite like as granular. Either you parry it or you don't. You know, you don't take like 21% less damage from a hit instead of 19% if you had been stacking a little more versatility. The difference isn't that huge. Ultimately, strength is really what you're prioritizing, and that just comes down to item level. With the exception of some trinkets, you pretty much always want to maximize your item level. I love playing Prot Warrior. What else can I say? It's a simple class, but it's really strong. I really like the state of Prot Warrior right now. It's going to be a fun class to play in the upcoming raid. It's going to be fun to play in the upcoming season of Mythic Plus, and I can't wait to get to it. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.